Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. Before we dive into today's video, I just want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you who have subscribed to my channel. We officially reached 500 subscribers and I just can't believe it. I can't believe how many of you guys have chosen to interact with my little corner of the internet, whether you're commenting, liking, subscribing, watching. I just appreciate each and every one of you so much. I'm really grateful for the interactions that I have on here, and just a huge thank you if you have subscribed to my channel. And if you're watching now and you're not subscribed, then feel free to subscribe. We have a fun time around here. Without further ado, let's dive into today's video. So I just watched episode 6 of Lovecraft Country. Let's talk about it. As I anticipated last week in my review after watching the sneak peek for this episode, we did focus mostly on Tik and his backstory in South Korea. But what I didn't account for was that this episode would be so heavily focused on not Tik specifically, but rather Gia. This entire story was told from her perspective, and I thought that was a stroke of genius. What a difference it is to have this female character, this Korean woman, telling her own story from her perspective in her culture and her country during this turbulent time, because we were really able to delve into her world and her circumstances during this time, whilst also taking a look at the character of Tik from a completely different angle as opposed to what we're usually used to, with him being at the center of attention because he's the chosen one. And not only that, but this series actually takes it one step further, and for most of this episode the characters are only speaking in Korean, and I thought that was a fantastic choice because it really allows you to kind of sink into this culture, and it feels so much more authentic to hear the characters speaking their mother tongue. And at the same time, it also acts as a great juxtaposition between when Gia is speaking to Tik, where she's speaking English that she likely learned from the films that she was watching. Now, we cannot go any further into this review without me mentioning the incredible performance by Jamie Chung. Wow, she did that. She owned this episode. She ate it up. Oh my god, she was so good, because not only did she have to act in Korean, and she is a Korean American, but she did have to practice the language just to make sure that she was so fluent that it felt authentic. Not only did she do that, but then she was able to convey emotion as a Korean person who was speaking English as a second language. Can we talk about the skill? Can we talk about how she was really able to convey the array of emotions that were explored in this episode in not one but 2 languages? She was so good. And really, this just carries on the trend that this show has of having these incredible female characters who are just brilliantly portrayed. Whether you're talking about Ruby or Letty or even Christina, for all of her faults, they are all such powerful female characters, and the actresses portraying them are so good. And here we just have a continuation of that in the form of Jamie Chung. But in this situation, because we are dropped into a completely foreign land, a completely foreign culture and lore, she really has to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of, you know, bringing us into that world and making it feel authentic, whilst at the same time having us follow this character's journey. And that was such an achievement, because unlike Ruby, who we saw last week had a whole episode focused on her, we hadn't actually been introduced to Jiha. The only time that we'd really seen her was in the first episode, where she was portrayed as this like alien-like creature who was like painted in red, and also in the second episode where we saw Tik hallucinate her and have a fight with her, but we didn't really understand what her character was and what her importance was to Tik. Now, this perspective is not only novel narratively in terms of the show overall, but it's also incredibly novel because of the subject matter that it focuses on. Here we have a very heavy emphasis on American imperialism. Love to see it. We have a heavy emphasis on American imperialism, which is a subject that doesn't get enough attention, but here we see it at full force at the dawn of the Korean War in 1949. After World War II has ended, here we have one of the first proxy wars of the Cold War era, and it is a fascinating subject for this show to tackle, and it kind of continues on this pattern that HBO productions have been starting, especially if I think back to Watchmen last year, of them tackling on these events in history that were forgotten throughout time and kind of bringing them to the forefront and showing showing people the atrocities associated with them, as was the case with Watchmen and the Tulsa Massacre of June 1921. Before I'd watched that show, I had no idea what the Tulsa Massacre was, but after watching it, best believe I'm never going to forget that date. This show continues on its journey of bringing forward some social commentary and analysis of American culture in the 20th century, but here we have it from a completely different perspective. Like I said, it's that of American imperialism. Because we've taken the American characters out of America, we are able to see how the people who are in these foreign lands view them. Now, like I said, in this episode, the year is 1949, and we are first introduced to the character of Gia when she is sitting down in a movie theater watching a Judy Garland film. Now, Judy Garland herself is a very present character in this story. She makes several appearances through the big screen because clearly Gia is a huge fan of hers. And I think, having watched Judy from last year, because I didn't really know much about Judy Garland beforehand, I would say that the connection there is that of the abuse, that abuse angle which runs so deeply in the character of Gia, as we're going to discuss. It's something that she shares with Judy Garland, and I think it's a very interesting parallel there when you think about how Judy was treated by the golden age of Hollywood, studio system. I think you can definitely see the parallels in terms of the abuse that both women endured. But in the case of Gia, as a Korean woman who's watching these American films, she likely doesn't even know the realities of Judy Garland's existence in that Hollywood studio system. She's just looking at the fantasy. She's just relishing in this idealistic depiction of the American dream, the perfect woman who just falls in love. She has her happily ever after. And this is something that Gia is fascinated by because, as it turns out, she's not just a regular woman, she is a Kumiho. I hope I didn't butcher that name too badly. I tried to practice beforehand. But essentially, this Kumiho is a nine-tailed fox-like spirit that resembles a Japanese kitsune. And here we find out that Jiha actually has this spirit inside of her body, inside of her physical form, as a result of her mother having summoned it. We find out that the original Jiha, before she was inhabited by this spirit, she was horribly sexually abused by her stepfather. And after a while, her mother seemed to have let it happen to some extent, but then she couldn't take it any longer, and she summoned this spirit so that the spirit would kind of take control of her daughter's body and get vengeance on her husband. Now, like in every single episode of Lovecraft Country so far, here we're exploring yet another angle of the horror genre. But in this case, it's completely divorced from the usual, American tropes that we see, because here we have a focus on Korean lore, which again fits in perfectly with the whole setup of this episode having taken place in Korea. But just like the other episodes of this show, what this episode did so well was take in this horror aspect, take in this kind of mystical creature, and use it to create this social commentary, this very powerful social commentary on something that all human beings face. In this case, the question is, what makes a human being? What is the difference between a human being and a monster? Because Kia is this evil spirit. She has this evil spirit inside of her, and her mother has told her that until she kills 100 men, until she takes the souls of 100 men, she will never be a human again. She will never be the daughter that she once was. So Gia is plagued with this inner conflict of wanting to please her mother and wanting her mother to have her daughter back, her original daughter back, the human being that she could actually love, but also wanting to discover herself and wanting to discover her true inner identity. And this is something that we see throughout the episode, where she makes friends with that other nurse who ends up being killed by Tick. We'll talk about Tick in a second. She makes friends with her, and you see that this is the very first time where someone has taken that moment to really look her in the eye and try to understand her and try to actually see her for who she really is. Because at the beginning of the episode, we see that when she's in class, she's very much isolated from everyone else. No one is really talking to her, but it's that other nurse, that other girl, who looks at her and really sees her for the very first time, and they develop this really touching friendship. And so Gia, for the first time, starts to see what it's like to form that human bond and that emotional connection with someone else. And so she starts having doubts in her mind about why it is that her mother insists that she has to change herself in order to feel those emotions. And of course you have the arrival of Tick. Now this happens about like halfway through the episode. I remember watching the episode and thinking, hang on, I haven't seen Tick anywhere here. But it was a good halfway point until we actually saw Tick appear, and it was in a very inconspicuous way. Like I didn't even really recognize him in that setting. It was done so well because you saw him through the perspective of Gia, and through Gia's eyes at that moment, he wasn't anyone special. Like he wasn't the chosen one that we've been following throughout these 5 or 6 episodes now. He was just another American soldier. And so when he steps into view, it takes you a moment to even register that it's him, until of course he shoots that nurse's head. And then in that moment, you're just overwhelmed with these emotions of this is our protagonist and he just shot an innocent woman. Like, how is this happening right now? And it really makes you question the moral standing of this character. And this show has done a great job with each and every one of these characters in that regard. Not a single one of them are, you know, good or evil and cut and dry in that way. They all have nuance and complexity to them, and I think this episode just added a little bit more of that to Tick's character. Then going back to Jiha, because this episode is about her, she experiences anger for the very first time. True, unadulterated fury, and I absolutely loved it. This is the man who shot her friend, her first ever friend, presumably, at least since she had been taken over by this evil spirit, and he was just lying there. And of course this is someone who has already taken the souls of many other men who have done much less to her, so the idea of taking his soul as well would just come so much more easily to her. And now she actually has a motivation that she can stand behind. It made for a really good point of contention for those characters before of course they transition their relationship over to a romance. Now if you've been watching my Lovecraft Country reviews, you'll know that I'm not the biggest fan of the character of Tick to begin with. I find him to be quite annoying and quite self-centered and self-absorbed. And yes, I understand he's become obsessed with the language of Adam because that magic is attracting him. But it's just like Letty said, like this is all happening to everyone. It's not just about him. And the fact that we got a glimpse of some of the heinous things that he had to do as a soldier in the Korean War, it really didn't help his case, at least in my mind. But seeing him lying there on that bed, you know, trying to read his book, his glasses falling and breaking, and his just frustration. He was so frustrated. He felt so helpless at that moment. It did kind of defrost my heart just a little bit. And I'll admit, it worked. It definitely worked in terms of convincing me why GR would change her mind and actually start to fall for Tick. He was no longer just this faceless, emotionless murderer who had killed her friend in cold blood, but rather he was a man with a lot of complexity to him, with some layers to him, and also with a backstory that kind of mirrors her own in terms of, you know, his relationship with Montrose and her relationship with her mother being very abusive. But before we get the lovey-dovey part of the episode, there is that scene where Jiha has agreed to meet with Tick at the army base, and I don't know about you guys, but I was terrified. I was terrified. I literally said out loud, if something goes wrong during this scene, Tick is dead to me. When Tick's Korean American friend met up with her, I was like, where is he leading her to? Because obviously this episode explores American imperialism, and it also touches on the atrocities that were committed by American soldiers during the Korean War. And so during that moment, I was very tense because I was hyper aware of the fact that she was this lone Korean woman who was entering an army base in the middle of the night. Like, I was very, very afraid for her, but thankfully it ended up being something cute and romantic, and Tick had a flower and he had this lopsided projection of a Judy Garland film. So I think that was really sweet and adorable, and that's kind of the genesis of their love story from there. I will say, in terms of the portrayal of their love story in this episode, it did feel a bit rushed, just because, like I said, it's not until the halfway point that we actually see Tick in Korea, and so they have a lot of catching up to do at that point. So it did feel a bit rushed to see them kind of fall in love and have this relationship playing in the snow. You know, I understood what they were trying to do. They were trying to establish that they'd had a very close emotional connection before everything went to crap. So like I said, this episode very much explored the idea of monsters versus humans. You know, what is the differentiation between a monster versus a human being? And especially in the backdrop of a war where you have human beings acting like monsters as they follow orders, and especially in the case of Gia, you have her, you know, taking on 99 souls, 99 men, but at the same time she feels horrible and she feels guilt-ridden. She never really relishes in that. It's more of a job to her. It's something that has been enforced upon her by her mother. And then you see Tick, who's in a very similar situation where he is one of the soldiers who's following orders, but he doesn't take joy in that either. In fact, he's incredibly emotionless when he carries out the shooting of that nurse. So when we see these characters come together and their love story unfolds, even though it is kind of fast forwarded, you still feel like there is a genuine relationship there and a genuine connection there, even if it is based on trauma and based on abuse. But the scene that I found to be one of the most powerful of the entire episode was when all of this came to question when Gia had a conversation with her mother, because her mother was once again demanding that she gather those 100 souls so that she could bring her daughter back. And Gia tries to explain to her mother that she's had a change of heart. You know, she sees that she can be as human as she'll ever be with this spirit inside of her. She doesn't have to gather another soul in order to be a human being. That's just not something that she wants to do anymore, because she feels fulfilled that she can form this emotional bond with Tick and fall in love with him, and he loves her back. And that was such a striking moment to me, because she was 100% right. How is it that she was able to form this emotional bond with not only that nurse friend of hers from earlier, but also Tick? But at the same time, her mother is trying to tell her that that's just impossible because she'll never be a human being because she's this evil monster. It's implied throughout the episode that the real monster is the one who's staring Gia in the face and even spitting in her face, after she was the one that overlooked the abuse that Gia was going through as a child by the hands of her husband. But in the end, we do see that Gia's mother's warning ends up being true, because we do see that Tick ends up rejecting her after finding out that she is this creature, that she has this spirit within her, in the most violent and horrific way, I might add. Listen, in Tick's defense, and I don't really want to defend him, but it was a pretty crazy way to find out. Like, she would have been better off if she just explained it using that book. Like, I feel like she wanted to even, but unfortunately they were already in the midst of things and it just got out of hand, and it was pretty graphic, something that he probably has imprinted in his mind forever. But still, it was so heartbreaking, especially having seen the journey that got them to their relationship. The fact that Tick rejected her in this harsh, cruel way, the fact that he had so much fear when he looked at her. She had actually managed to see some of Tick's future, and she was trying to warn him that Tick was going to end up being killed if he goes home. And this ties us back into episode 5, where we saw Tick make that frantic call to Gia after he spelt out some of this, you know, language of Adam stuff. After he had deciphered a code which read die, apparently. Now, to this point, I don't quite understand how the episode that we witnessed ties into that directly. I don't understand why he thought she would know the language of Adam, just because she's a mystical creature, I guess. Just because she's tapped into the world of magic and she seems to be his first magical encounter, so I guess maybe he made that connection that way. But there's no real suggestion throughout the episode that she knows the language of Adam. We do get another scene with Gia and her mother where they go to visit the shaman, and it appears that her mother has kind of come to terms with who Gia really is, and the fact that she doesn't want to sacrifice yet another soul in order to bring her humanity back. She's happy with the way that she is, even after being rejected by Tick. But in this scene, we also have Gia telling the shaman, or the Shawoman, I guess, that she saw Tick's future and whether or not that future is actually going to come to pass. And the Shawoman is telling her, like, why are you concerned with the problems of mortals? You know, you are an immortal spirit. You are beyond them. Why are you concerned with this? And it just goes back to the whole premise of Gia just being so obsessed with being human. She wants to be human, and she's formed this human connection with Tick, and she's not ready to let that go even after he rejected her. So overall, I really enjoyed this episode. The whole show kind of took this whole left turn into a completely different culture with a completely different lead character, and I kind of loved it. It was like watching a short film within in this show that explored, you know, themes of the Korean War and American imperialism, but also what it means to be a human being versus what it means to be a monster, and what it means to have, you know, emotional ties and connections to other human beings who you kind of see some part of yourself in. And this episode actually reminded me a lot of the Watchmen episode, A God Walks into a Bar, I believe it's called. Also, I did want to point out as a final point, because I completely forgot to mention it earlier on, that when Gia is watching the films, the Julie Garland films in the cinemas, she's watching it in English, and there's kind of a parallel there between, you know, us watching this episode at the halfway point and it's all in Korean versus, you know, her watching those films in English. And it very much reminded me of Bong Joon-ho's comments from earlier this year, although it feels like a decade ago now, where he was talking about that 1-inch barrier, that being the subtitles. And to see a character like Jiha just enraptured by these old Hollywood films that did still have the subtitles at the bottom there, is just something that was really inspiring and very much in line with what Bong Joon-ho said about foreign films. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Lovecraft Country episode 6, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this show down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching and subscribing. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.